Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to those who are participating virtually as well. My name is Abdul Abiad. I'm Director of Macroeconomic Research at the Asian Development Bank. And this session is on mobilizing taxes for developing Asia. And first, I'd like to thank the Global Development Network for inviting us to join this very interesting conference. Yes, so developing Asia, as we've heard throughout this conference, is having challenges with domestic resource mobilization. You will see in the presentations today about where tax revenues stand and how it compares to other regions. But also, most of you know, many developing economies and advanced economies the revenues took a hit during the pandemic, and spending had to increase to support the economy. And then now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has put additional spending pressures in many economies to try to support those who have been hit by rising prices. And the discussion today will be focused on what's happened recently, and more importantly, where do we go from here as economies recover from the pandemic? What are prospects for taxes, and what does it mean for developing Asian economies as they try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? So with that, let me introduce our various speakers. So we're going to have three presentations. The first presentation today will be titled Mobilizing Taxes for Development, and it'll be presented by two of my colleagues, Donghyun Park to my right and Yothin Jinjarak at the extreme left. They're both from the research department of the Asian Development Bank. The second presentation will be on Revenue Statistics in Asia by Céline Collin from the OECD. And the third presentation will be Measuring Structural Budget Balances in Developing Asia by Joao Jalles from the University of Lisbon. So each presentation will be about 20 to 25 minutes. And we'll actually go through all the presentations and then have the Q&A at the end so that it doesn't eat up into anybody's presentation time. But given there are just a few of us here, and if there are any online, I will monitor the... Please put up your hand if you have any questions for clarification, and we can take them even during the presentation so that it's more interactive rather than just one person speaking. So with that, let me turn over to Yothin. Go ahead, Yothin.
Hello. Yes. Well, thank you, Abdul. Yes, let me start by the statement that I think resonates with all of us. That thanks. That the long-term sustainable development demands long-term domestic resources. Right? And when we think about the domestic resources, there are the domestic fiscal resources and domestic financial resources, right, from the private sector. Now, for the domestic fiscal resources, tax revenues is probably one of the long-term and dependable resources for the government. One can also say that tax revenue is the government's best friend, right? It's long-term and dependable. Now, if we think about Asia, in Asia, I think like in the several parts of developing regions of the world, even before the pandemic, there was already the high demand for development in many areas, education, the health, and social protection. That is even before the pandemic hit. And then when the pandemic hit, that demand increased significantly, right? Let me share with you this diagram. I hope that you can see it from the back. So when you think about the demands for development in the education and health, Asia is no different from other developing economies. There's still a high demand for spending in the health, development, and social protection. This demand needs to be satisfied by the mobilization of domestic resources, in particular from tax revenue. Right? So if you look at this diagram, this is the data that shows the association between the tax revenue on the horizontal axis and spending on education and health on the vertical axis. And you can see a positive relationship between the two quite clearly. In particular for Asia, the relationship between the tax revenue and spending on education and health are quite positive and significant, right? So it means that if we want to continue developing the education and health and have more sustainable development, it means that the mobilization of fiscal resources, in particular tax revenue, is really the key for Asia. Now, before the pandemic, what we see in the data is the tax revenue in Asia was increasing. It was increasing all the way to 2019. Now, the level of tax revenue in Asia is increasing before the pandemic, but still, it is below the level of OECD, much below level of OECD, and somewhat below the level of Latin America, right? So that means there's a need to improve tax collection and tax policy in developing Asia. And then when the pandemic hit, our data shows that tax revenue dropped. For some economies, it dropped more significantly than others. Now, what I would like to discuss next is this is probably not the Asia is probably not the exception when we think about how the pandemic hit the tax revenue, right? But to gain some traction on how the government position when it comes to mobilizing the tax revenue, maybe we need to look at some policy tools. And that policy tools that I want to discuss with you is the tool called tax buoyancy, right? So this tax buoyancy is the tool that allow policymaker to monitor how tax revenue respond to the output and GDP growth. Essentially, if the tax buoyancy is equal to 1, that is when we look at the association between the tax revenue and the GDP growth, and we find that the coefficient of correlation between two is equal to 1, then we have the case of fiscal sustainability, whereby tax revenue increased 1-to-1 with the GDP growth. If tax buoyancy coefficient is more than 1, then we have the case of tax revenue growing faster than the GDP growth. And if it's less than 1, then we have the opposite case. So as you can now probably sense that these policy tools can be quite helpful, right? In terms of understanding how tax revenue respond to the state of the economies. And this is the tool that we would like to show you how it reflects the state of tax revenue in Asia. Right. Now, to do that, let me discuss very briefly, right, how we go about this. Because I understand that in this policy forum, we have both the economists and non-economists, but I think to understand the policy too, it's good to discuss a bit about how we go about this business. So if we look at the tax revenue statistics for any country, you would have, say, annual time series of tax revenues, right? And it can go up and down depending on the state of the economy. If you want to see how the tax revenue respond to the output or GDP growth, you can correlate these two time series for each country, right? And by doing that correlation, then you would have the sense of how strong the correlation is. And that would give you the indicator of tax buoyancy in a nutshell. Now, for our analysis we recently done, we look at 25 economies in Asia. One challenge with analyzing the sustainability of tax revenue is that when you look across times, you need data that is quite complete, that is the non-missing data. It's going to be a challenge when you do this statistical analysis. So for the 46 countries in Asia that we are looking into, we end up with 25 economies with complete data of tax revenues and the GDP that allow us to conduct this tax buoyancy analysis, to look at how the tax revenue respond to the GDP growth. So what did we find? Well, in the case of Asia, we find that the tax buoyancy coefficient, or the measure of tax sustainability, is reasonably good. In fact, the coefficient of tax buoyancy is greater than 1 in most of the countries that we look into. So that means when we think about how tax revenue respond to the GDP growth, for Asia, right? Tax revenue grow faster than the GDP growth. And that is a good signal when we think about the fiscal sustainability, at least when it comes to tax revenue. Now, within Asia, though, we see some differences. In Asia, we have sub-regions that is more tax buoyant than others. Southeast Asia is more tax buoyant. That is, the tax revenue in Southeast Asia respond more strongly to GDP growth than other sub-regions. The picture in the South Asia is quite mixed. Some economies respond strongly to GDP growth, but some less so. And then we have quite a weak tax buoyancy or tax responses to GDP growth in the Pacific and the Central Asia. So that is the pattern that we observed so far in the region. Okay, now if we want to understand how this is useful, right? So far we know that, okay, tax revenue in the Asia respond quite significantly to the GDP growth, and the so-called tax buoyancy is greater than 1 in the region. We can apply this to understand what happened during the COVID-19 crisis, right? I mentioned earlier that during the COVID-19, the tax revenue declined in Asia. Now, again, that is not the exception. Most economies suffer the same tax loss, but to what extent that tax loss is more than expected, that is the question, right? So if we have the monitoring tool, the tax buoyancy tool, we can apply this to predict what would happen to the tax to GDP during the crisis, right? So that's the prediction that we can get from the pre-COVID data. Then we can compare that prediction with the actual tax revenue during the COVID-19 crisis. The difference between the two would be the gap that we can call the excess tax loss. More like during the pandemic, you probably recall the concept of excess debt. This is the somewhat related concept, but applied to the taxes. So excess tax loss, that is the level of tax loss that is beyond what we would expect in the typical economic downturn. So we done that, and we found that for Asia, we observe decline tax revenue that is more than expected compared to the typical economic downturn. Some economies observe more decline than others. So this shows that in the case of Asia, we are not exempted from the pandemic downturn, of course, but beyond that, the tax revenue in Asia also declined more than what we would have expected, given the typical economic downturn. So let me pass it to my colleague, Donghyun Park.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, thanks a lot, Yothin. So now I will present the second part of our presentation, which is based on the Asian Development Outlook 2022 special theme chapter on mobilizing taxes for development. By the way, the Asian Development Outlook, or ADO, is ADB's annual flagship report published twice a year, once in April and again in September. So Yothin, my colleague, Yothin gave a very nice overview, right, of the broader landscape of tax revenues in developing Asia, as well as the responsiveness of tax revenues to the ups and downs of the economic cycle, right, to economic growth. So now let's turn our attention to the priorities for tax mobilization in developing Asia. In other words, what are the key priorities for mobilizing greater amounts of tax revenue collection in the region? So if we benchmark tax revenue against each economy structure, for example, share of foreign trade and share of agriculture and other sectors, we find that on average, there is potential to boost or increase tax revenues by 3 to 4% of GDP. So that's quite substantial for a country like Indonesia, which, where the tax revenue to GDP ratio is less than 15%. If there is this kind of additional mobilization, of course, that will increase that ratio to above 15%. But of course, how to best mobilize taxes and what are the key priorities for mobilizing taxes, that's going to differ from country to country, right? And it's going to depend on country-specific circumstances. So let's consider tax expenditures, which are special tax concessions or tax breaks. For instance, there are a lot of countries offer tax breaks, right, for foreign investors, right, which are designed to attract foreign direct investment, which purportedly creates jobs, helps boost economic growth, and so forth. So this chart shows the level of tax expenditures in several different developing Asian countries. So tax expenditures cost or sacrifice about 14% of total tax revenues in developing Asia. And by any measure, that's a substantial amount. I think this morning we had a very nice session, right, on tax expenditures. So there are three big problems with tax expenditures. What are the three big problems? Above all, they are not reported and scrutinized like other fiscal items in the budget. Secondly, once you provide a tax expenditure, they're difficult to remove. And third, last but not least, the benefits they yield, for example, attracting foreign investment, are quite difficult to measure and not always clear. In other words, it's not always clear that these tax breaks for foreign investors bring in more foreign FDI, foreign direct investment, than they would in their absence. More specifically, many surveys of foreign investors suggest that, in fact, other factors, for example, availability of skilled labor or quality and reliability of infrastructure, such as electricity, are much more important than tax incentives in attracting foreign investors. So to better mobilize fiscal resources, these tax expenditures have to be evaluated more systematically, and I think that was what the expert from Georgia, right, talked about yesterday. Okay. So next slide. So what is developing Asia's main sources of tax revenues? Well, it's a value-added tax, and also, to a lesser extent, corporate income tax. So we don't collect that much personal income tax and property tax, which I will discuss briefly in the next slide. But really, VAT, or value-added tax, is our mainstay in terms of tax revenues. So this is a core tax revenue, but it can still do better. We can still do better. In other words, we can still harvest or collect more VAT. And this is evident in the fact that the share of or ratio of VAT revenue to GDP in developing Asia is lower than in both Latin America and the high-income OECD countries, even though, again, VAT is our core tax revenue. And we can significantly expand VAT by broadening the VAT tax base, for example, by expanding the coverage of VAT to the digital economy. Of course, developing Asia has a vibrant, right, and rapidly growing digital economy. And furthermore, as this chart shows, the standard VAT rates are on average lower in developing Asia than in Latin America, and much lower than in the high-income countries, OECD countries. Promisingly, however, there are some recent efforts to expand VAT. For example, Indonesia announced that it will increase its VAT rate from 10% to 11% this year in 2022. Okay, now let's move to the two less heavily utilized revenue sources. The two main sources are VAT in particular and corporate income taxes. The somewhat, again, underutilized revenue sources in developing Asia are personal income taxes and property taxes. But strengthening these can, of course, support more revenue collection as well as support progressivity, because both of these taxes are inherently quite progressive, right, for obvious reason. So this chart that you see, it shows that self-employment has declined in Asia, and this is good news for personal income tax because it means tax authorities have more information, right, have more data. So this is good for personal income tax collection. However, we should keep in mind that the personal income tax sometimes creates negative incentives or disincentives against labor supply. For example, if the personal income tax is imposed on households, right, then of course that tends to discourage the labor force participation of women, who tend to be secondary income earners in most cases. Furthermore, in developing Asia, the personal income tax rate is often set low, and the top marginal rate is set at very high income levels. Of course, both of these can be revised to further boost personal income tax revenue. Another underutilized source of revenue is this property tax. And to improve property tax collection across the region, we need better property valuation so that the properties reflect the valuation reflect their market value rather than their value 5 to 10 years ago. And we also need better coordination between the central government and the local governments, right? And corporate income taxes, which are not underutilized, but which is a main revenue source. The two-pillar multilateral initiative under IF, right, the inclusive framework, it's a promising development. this two-pillar initiative, it should ease the pressure of tax competition and, just as importantly, provide greater certainty to taxpayers as well as tax administration. Okay, so now we talked about these core taxes, right? VAT and more generally consumption taxes, and then corporate income tax, personal income tax, property tax. But there are, of course, beyond these core taxes, there are new taxes that address very significant challenges, such as climate change, such as the environment, right? And then, of course, these also have a significant revenue-generating potential for the region. And these are not entirely new to the region, by the way. Many Asian economies have used these kinds of taxes, environmental taxes, I mean, especially taxes on fossil fuels, but they collected relatively little. In fact, as we learned throughout this conference, many countries also have fuel subsidies, right? And often they're highly regressive. They benefit the middle classes driving around their big cars, right, in the big national capitals, right, with relatively little benefits to the poor. So, but more recently, some economies have started very gradually, I have to say, introducing carbon taxes as well as ETS, emission trading schemes. But because of competitiveness concerns, in other words, the idea that these environmental taxes will compromise or reduce the competitiveness of the country's industries and firms, right, relative to those of countries that without such environmental taxes, and also, perhaps more importantly, distributional concerns, the idea that these kinds of environmental taxes will disproportionately hurt the poor. Because of these reasons, Asian governments up to now have been quite cautious and very gradual. So this chart shows that carbon tax rates and carbon tax revenues are very low, even for Singapore and Japan. As far as the ETS or emission trading schemes goes, the permits are often distributed free of charge, which of course greatly limit their revenue generation. By the way, PRC, Korea, my country, and Kazakhstan, they all have national ETS, and Thailand and Vietnam, right? They have introduced pilot ETS.
Okay. 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So now, so we talked about one non-core tax, although it's very much a core tax if we think about the challenge that it's trying to address, the environment, right? What can be more core than that? But of course, in terms of tax revenue, environmental taxes are very new. They are non-core tax. Another non-core tax in the region is corrective health taxes. And of course, this alcohol, tobacco, and Coca-Cola and all these sugar-sweetened beverages are bad for health, right? And they greatly increase the incidence of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, heart conditions, and so forth. So taxing these unhealthy products, it's good for public health, and it can raise significant revenue, right? Significant amounts of revenue. So it's a double dividend, right? Two benefits. But these health taxes remain far too low, as this chart shows. For cigarette taxes, Asia's cigarette taxes, shown in solid blue line, much lower than in advanced countries, shown in solid pink line. And the data also suggests that the revenue from tobacco taxes is far lower than the health cost, productivity cost, economic cost, and all these damages associated with tobacco consumption. Another reason which suggests that there is significant scope, economic case, or economic reason for strengthening or expanding these corrective health taxes. And in fact, we did some analysis. The potential for corrective health taxes to generate additional tax revenue is up to 0.6% of developing Asia's GDP. So this is my final slide. So as you can see, What is the potential for tax reform, for meaningful tax reform? Well, there is significant potential. That's what this last slide shows. Several economies in the region implemented tax reforms that significantly boosted tax revenue. I think one of the countries is in fact Georgia, right? Where the expert from Georgia yesterday talked about their experience, right? Their success in boosting revenues. So what is the common factor in all these countries? Strong political leadership, which generates buy-in from the general public. Timing can also be important. For example, it may be, paradoxically, it may be easier to do reforms during crisis periods, right? Because everybody at that time understands that tax reform is urgent. You have to do it. There are no other options. For example, Greece, right? The debt crisis, the fiscal crisis. So Greece launched a significant fiscal reforms, right? Which was precipitated by the crisis. So because in developing Asia, VAT is the main source of revenue, reforming VAT has to be part of an effective package. And at the same time, broader economic reform, which is not really linked to taxes in the narrow sense, can also play a key role. For example, reducing business registration costs, that can help to boost the formal sector, reduce the informal sector, and that in turn can increase the tax base for collection. And of course, any measures that really help to promote economic dynamism, economic activity, entrepreneurship. For example, by sharply reducing corruption, right? That can greatly increase the tax base, and that is really the way to go to boost tax revenues. Finally, and this is, I think, one of the main themes of this workshop, governments can certainly strengthen the willingness of households, individuals, and companies to comply, to pay their taxes when they show the public they're getting something back in return by improving the quality of fiscal spending, improving the quality of public services. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I'd invite again, quite broad. If you take a look at the theme chapter that Tom and Yothin presented, it really covered the stylized facts on sort of what's happening, sources of revenue, level of revenue, and again, going into the different taxes. So I'd invite everybody to take a look at the paper because they really weren't able to cover everything in the time allotted to them. But thank you very much for that, Tom. So we now turn to Celine Colan, who's again a tax economist in the Tax Policy and Tax Statistics Division of the OECD, the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. And again, Celine will present their work on trends, challenges, and impact of COVID-19 on tax revenues.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here today with us. So let me start the presentation. So this presentation is going to be based on the publication called Revenue Statistics in Asia Pacific that covers 28 economies. This is work that we do in partnership with regional partners such as the ADB, among others, but also participating countries. Before I start, let me just remind you what has been said yesterday in that same room. Two things that were really important in my views and give a bit of a background to this presentation. Number one is someone said that data are a radar because it gives direction of change. That's totally true, and I'll come back to this. And the second is something that Mario Mensur from the IMF mentioned. He said, we should say that data is development instead of data for development. And again, I think this is very correct, and I'll come back to that point later. And this morning we heard, I think that was from the World Bank, someone saying that tax policy units are necessary in countries to help guide the decision, and data is needed to feed the analysis of those units. Without data, those units cannot do much. So this publication is about data. It collects information on tax and non-tax revenues in a very detailed, harmonized, and standardized manner, which is beneficial for participating countries for several reasons. Number one is because classifying taxes means that we need to understand the core characteristics of each tax. And in this publication, taxes are organized based on their base. So we're going to look at taxes on goods and services, taxes on income, etc. It also allows for country comparison and country benchmarking, so to give a bit of a sense of where your country is positioned in the region or in your income group or against more advanced economies. And that's crucial for a discussion. Which lead to the point of transparency. The fact that you can discuss where you stand is crucial when you want to, for a dialogue within the government, but also outside the government with external stakeholders. And that's also key for evaluation. The evaluation of the performance of the overall tax system, but also the performance of individual taxes. So statistics are sometimes considered as very dry, but that's the core of any tax analysis that come afterwards. So now what do we observe in the latest revenue statistics publication, which cover the year 2020, so when the pandemic hit? We see that on average, the tax to GDP ratio was 19%, which is lower than in the LAC, Latin America region, but also OECD countries. If you look at individual countries, it ranged from 8.9% in Bhutan and Laos to about 47% in Nauru. If you exclude Nauru, then it is 32% in New Zealand, and then if you exclude the 4 OECD countries, we see somewhat 25%. That means that there is a very high range of tax to GDP ratio. And that can be explained by several factors, structural factors such as the size of your informal sector, the size of your agricultural sector, but also whether you are open to trade, whether you are small island states. Obviously, you will face different challenges, but also very importantly, the way your tax policy is designed and the way your tax administration function, such as, for example, the size of your tax base, your administrative capacities, the access to data you have to guide the policy decision, etc., etc. In this work, when we speak about taxes, we mean compulsory and requited payments made to general governments. And requited in the sense that the benefits provided by the government to taxpayers are not normally in proportion to their payments. And because of this definition, we do include SSCs, so social security contributions, in the definition. On this graph, you can see two ratios, with and without SSCs. That's because all Pacific economies do not levy SSCs. The reason is because the way they finance their social protection system is through general revenues and not through SSCs. That being said, it's not the same when you speak about Asian economies that do levy SSCs. So you can see here the variation of ratios. Now, if we look at the evolution from 2019 to 2020, no surprise, the region was massively impacted by the consequences of COVID. On average, the tax to GDP ratio declined by 1.2 percentage point, which is a more significant drop than in Latin America. If you look at this region here represented in red, on average, and about 3/4 of economies have experienced a drop. If you look at the right-hand side of the graph, you see massive decreases, sometimes above 2% of GDP. That's the case, for example, for Kazakhstan, Mongolia, but also small island states such as Vanuatu, Fiji, and the Cook Islands. Obviously, for those 3 countries, that can be explained by the drop in tourism and the border closures. For the first 2, it can also be explained by the drop in mineral prices. Now, if we look at the drop in nominal tax revenues, where we can, so that's the country that are below that horizontal line, you can see that most countries are actually below. So 20 out of 26 economies for which we do have data for 2020 have experienced falls in nominal tax revenues in between 2019 and 2020. On average, it fell by about 9%, which is just huge. For some countries, the ones that are at the very bottom of the graph, it decreases by much more than 8%, 15% if you look at Indonesia, Vanuatu 19%, Maldives 33%, Fiji about 40%, and same for the Cook Islands. And what we observe also is that the majority of economies in the region have experienced declines in tax revenues, both in nominal terms, but also as a percentage of GDP, and that's the countries you can see in that triangle on the bottom left. Now, so we looked at tax to GDP ratio, but now let's have a few words on the tax mix. But already much has been said, so I'll be a bit quick here. But as you've heard, the first source of tax revenues in the region is taxes on goods and services. And that's countries in Group A and B, and you can see this is the majority of countries. In Group A, VAT is the first source of revenues, while in Group E, it's going to be non-VAT revenues, such as excise, for instance. Group C, that's countries relying mostly on income taxes. And D, which is only composed of Japan, that's social security contribution, that's this orange bar. In the case of Japan, for example, it's more than 40% of total tax revenues that are generated through SSCs in 2019. But if you look at this little orange bar in other countries, it is significant. So if you think of Philippines, it's about 16%, Mongolia, 18%, China, Korea, and Vietnam is about 30%. So this is significant for some countries. What this graph shows indirectly, and that has been said already, is that the region is not reliant on environmentally tax, unfortunately, which on average is less than 1% of GDP in 2020. So as we said, the majority of economies experienced a very sharp drop in tax revenues with the crisis, but the channel through which revenues were impacted differed. So in the Pacific Islands, the tax to GDP ratio decreased primarily due to lower revenues on taxes on goods and services, while in Asia, that was because of a drop in across taxes, so taxes levied on exports and imports, from natural resources, but also VAT, CIT, etc., etc. So because of the tax mixes, the response during the crisis, the channel through countries were affected also obviously differed. So this is to give you a bit of a sense of where we are. Also, importantly, the fiscal response, policy response to the crisis by countries were significant. So on average, countries supported their economies by more than 5% of GDP, while at the same time experienced a serious drop in tax revenues. So as you can imagine, those countries have emerged from the crisis with very weak government financing. Deficits and debts are much higher than they were after the 2008 financial crisis. So just to give you a sense, the deficit is now on average about minus 6% of GDP, and gross debt is above 60% of GDP. Of course, those countries have adopted measures during the crisis to help their economies, support the households and the businesses, and that's all fine, and it's actually a good thing that they've done that. But this is different from fundamental tax reforms that are long-term, gradual, that are prepared in advance with all the stakeholders on board. And those structural reforms, tax reforms, are now necessary to put the countries on a better footing in terms of their budgetary situation. You said that tax reforms are needed, and especially in crisis, there is no other choice. I fully support that view. and that's actually what the region shall do now. There is a need to raise more revenues, and this can go only through a tax reform. Tax reforms are not easy. Nobody wants to pay more taxes. Businesses do not want to be bothered, but that's the only way to make sure that the country can raise more revenues. They need to rebuild or to build a health system, but also education and social protection. And this can only come from more domestic resource mobilization. Now, how should they look like? Obviously, they need to be growth-friendly, but there is also a very strong case to make, and by saying that they need to be progressive. We need progressive tax system. If you look at this graph, the dark blue bars are the Gini coefficient before tax and benefits, while the light blue bar is after tax and benefits. So what we observe is that in Asia Pacific, the market income inequality, so that dark blue bar, is actually lower than in Latin America, but also advanced economy. So that's actually good news. But the problem is, when you look at the difference between the light blue bar and the dark blue bar, and that difference is very small and much smaller than in advanced economies. And that means that the tax and benefit system does not achieve sufficient redistribution. Because of the limited progressivity of the tax system, and here let me link to what we've heard before about the fact that countries do not rely sufficiently on the PIT, but also because the size of the benefits is very small or too small, and often also there is not enough a good targeting. So the conclusion is that the tax reform that are needed needs to be growth-friendly, that's for sure, but there is also a need to threaten the equity of your tax system, especially in countries that have high inequality, but also weak transfer systems. I'm not going to go back on the tax policy option in great details because that has been done previously, but let me just focus on one point here, which is the informality. Since yesterday, we've heard a lot of presentation, but in my view, we don't hear enough about the fact that on the ground, there is high informal sectors in developing countries. So the way you design your tax system needs to take this into account. So how to do that concretely, it's not easy. And when you want to reduce informality, the first answer is not going to come from the tax system. It's going to come from the way the labor market is functioning, but also the way the social protection is designed and whether people are incentivized to register to that social protection system to get benefits and contribute to it. Obviously, the tax system do have a role to play, but again, it's not going to come, the solution is not going to come from the tax system only. On this, let me just briefly tell you about what we are doing at the OECD on this, which in my view is very interesting and very promising. We are doing some work on what we call presumptive tax regimes. So those regimes that are targeted for very small taxpayers and very small businesses, with the aim not to raise a lot of revenues, but really to incentivize people and stakeholders to formalize and to be known from the tax administration. In the long run, the goal is that those stakeholders will grow and finally migrate into the standard system. So the goal is not that those stakeholders stay forever in those presumptive tax regimes. So there is a lot of paper out there on those regimes from an academic or a theoretical point of view, but very little on how actually they are designed and how they work. So what we've been doing so far is we have created an analytical framework that relies on 9 dimensions that cover both tax policy but also the tax administration side. So we look at the target group, the types of regime, whether it's based on turnover or not, and if not, what. The tax obligations, the tax that are covered, the administration of the regime, whether the stakeholders can have access to non-tax instruments, whether there is tax provision that will help smooth the transition from the regime towards the standard regimes or not, etc. And we've applied that framework to countries. So far we have 14 countries and about 25 regimes, because countries often have more than one regime in place, which is a question in itself, whether you should have one or more. And we also look at the regimes that were abolished in the past, and we try to understand why they've been abolished and what can be learned and what can be avoided in the future or for other countries. The bad news for this session is that we do not cover Asia yet. We cover Latin America economies, European economies, and a few African economies, but the goal really is to expand the work and to cover more countries, including Asian economies. We do think that when it comes to tax and informality, this is really value added for countries. We've been doing some work in an African economy recently that has about almost three now, presumptive tax regimes, which is too much. The Ministry of Finance was not really happy because another line ministry, Ministry of Employment, has implemented such a regime. And we helped them to improve the design of their current system so that there is no damaging effect by multiplying regimes. So that's really interesting, and we really hope that we'll be able to cover more ground, especially in this region. So that's going to be actually my last slide. I started this presentation by emphasizing the role of data. But let's not forget also that what's interesting for countries is to know what others are doing. Not because all countries shall have the same tax measures and the same tax reforms, obviously not. This is country-specific, and that shall remain country-specific. But for internal debate, it is interesting to see how you position and what others have been doing and whether you should do the same, and if not, why. You may be aware of this publication, which is called the Tax Policy Reform Publication that we do. It's an annual publication. Up to now, we used to cover only OECD and partner countries, so about 40 countries. And every year we look at what has been implemented. This year, we cover also 26 developing economies, including 4 in Asia. So that's Vietnam, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Cook Islands. And we look at what measures have been implemented across the different types of taxes. So on that slide, you're going to see what those countries have been doing. The point here is not to go through all the bullets. The point here is to say that this work is also interesting for countries. It helps them to guide and to understand the direction of the region or the direction of similar countries that have similar characteristics or a similar income level. Not to say that they all should do the same, but just to inform what they are doing and have a sense of whether they are going in a similar direction or not. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. For those of you who are interested in data, you can see the link here, and I'm happy to take any question at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Celine. And so yes, so just to give the audience a sense of informality in Asia and how much higher it is elsewhere, again, from the theme chapter, 85% of the share of informal workers overall is 85% compared to, let's say, 57% in Latin America. And 17% of startups in developing Asia are unregistered compared to, I think, something like 10% in Latin America. Okay, for our last presentation, I'd like to invite Joao Jalles, who's Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Lisbon. Prior to that, he was at the Portuguese Public Finance Council and also at the IMF, the OECD, and the ECB. And Joao will be presenting on, again, measuring structural budget balances in developing Asia. Go ahead, Joao.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my second time in Clermont. Unfortunately, I've been missing some sessions, but I hope to make it over. So this is a work in progress in collaboration with ADB colleagues, and this is a bit broader than what the previous two presentations have done. But the common theme is the need for good data to perform good empirical analysis. And so I'll be trying for 20 minutes, I'll try for 20 minutes to be as pedagogic as possible and not too technical, but let's see how it goes. So the idea here when talking about structural budget balances is a concept that it's common to be published in flagship publications like the World Economic Outlook or the European Commission as basically guiding numbers to assess and conduct monetary fiscal policy and inform about the other policy instruments that may be available to act in face of crisis or any other circumstance. So the outline is as you see here. I'll try to introduce the topic and see basically why and justify why we need a measure of what we call a cyclically adjusted budget balance or a structural balance, and then go through a set of methodologies and debates to come up with a set of numbers and applications that could be of use to ADB membership or any other organization to that matter. So the thing with this concept is that we need to understand budgetary developments for not only fiscal surveillance, but also fiscal monitoring, and actual budget balances figures are imperfect in that matter, because they are influenced by several factors that are temporary in nature, and some of them are not in the control of the fiscal authorities or the government. And first and foremost, those fluctuations are basically fluctuations in economic activity, so the regular business cycle playing its role. And so the budget figures should not be taken at face value as a measure or a proxy for the fiscal stance of a given country. They incorporate two aspects, temporary and permanent factors. And so the job to start disentangling these two factors came to life more than 30 years ago with Blanchard, but it goes back in time to the 1950s. But at least Olivier Blanchard was one of the first to formalize a little bit the concept of the cyclically adjusted budget balance in his seminal publication. The idea is that the CAB can help determine the fiscal position that would prevail were the economy at full capacity or basically at potential, meaning that would have a zero output gap. In addition, one has to take into account not only cyclical factors, but also other factors that have been increasingly become fashionable in this area, which are basically the so-called one-off temporary measures. These are basically sometimes one-off revenues from sales of communication or telecommunication licenses like 5G or privatizations of an airline, and so they should not be treated or recorded as standard budgetary procedures. So removing the impact of these cyclical fluctuations, but also these one-off measures, is what some organizations like the IMF call the structural budget balance, or the European Commission refers to as uncovering an underlying fiscal position. So the obtaining a measure or an estimate of this SB structural balance is surrounded by a number of uncertainty and issues that I'll try to expose to you as brief as I can. So on the one hand, we have basically to take a stance on what we mean by the cycle and how to treat it, and the second being, in this context, the size and nature of these one-off measures. We need this concept because, as I mentioned in the introduction, despite the many downsides in estimating and having an accurate number for the cyclically adjusted or the structural balance, they still are important to conduct comparative analysis and conduct fiscal policy making. Even if imperfect, it's better to have one that is imperfect than none. And they also are important as a concept, so the cyclically adjusted budget balances, because they can help us basically address other issues in public finances, like the role of fiscal stabilization, so this entangling discretionary fiscal policy from automatic stabilizers and their role, assessing the nature of fiscal impulses, so all the literature on fiscal multipliers, And thirdly, examining whether a given fiscal policy is sustainable in the long run, so all the issue about fiscal policy long-term debt sustainability analysis. So for that, and I think these are three sufficient reasons, that's why we need such a concept. And the methodology is to basically come up with a figure or a series for this variable, come down to three alternatives. One is basically Blanchard's suggestions in the 1990s for a regression-based analysis. You can also have structural vector autoregressions or what is called unobserved component models. Basically, in what follows, I will go through the first regression-based analysis, and here we can have two approaches, the aggregate or disaggregated approach. The aggregated approach started with the European Commission. The disaggregated approach, building on the shoulders of giants, then was developed by the OECD. And so basically, looking at the aggregated approach, what we have is a reaction of both government expenditures and revenues to deviations of actual output to its potential. And so we try to have a measure of the budget stripped out of these cyclical fluctuations, the advantage being that simply you need a sensitivity parameter of the budget to the output gap or a measure of slack in the economy, and it is a relatively simple exercise with minimal data requirements and can be relatively easy to communicate and allows for big cross-country comparisons, which is useful, especially if you are in an international organization and you want to apply consistently a methodology throughout different countries with different data points, missing different time spans and structural characteristics. The disadvantage being that it can only accurately measure the underlying fiscal position if fiscal aggregates basically behave similarly with respect to movements in the cycle, and they do not change much over time. So they're shared to GDP, but also their responses with respect to the cycle, which is, of course, too big assumptions to make. The OECD's disaggregated approach basically takes the aggregated one and goes deeper into both the revenue and spending components and tries to estimate spending elasticities by focusing more prominently on what is basically the most automatic component of spending, which is typically unemployment benefits, and on the revenue side by looking at both tax bases and the reaction of tax bases and tax rates, and those with respect to the cycle. The advantage of this approach is, of course, a better identification of the underlying composition effects of the different spending and tax elements, and in principle, a better or more precise underlying computation of the fiscal position. It basically also allows for this differentiating the impact of the underlying automatic stabilizers from both the spending and the revenue side. Of course, the disadvantage as you go deeper into the budgetary components and items, it becomes more data intensive, and for some membership of different international organizations, it may be difficult to come by. It also, but sometimes not feasible for larger cross-sectional applications and comparisons. So which to follow? It basically depends on the information that you have, and we go back to the previous presentation. And of course, the aggregated approach can mirror the weighted disaggregated approach if we have basically a composition of revenue and expenditures, as I mentioned, that does not vary much over time, but also those reactions between budgetary components and the business cycle, so the output gap, remain relatively constant, which may not happen, especially in face of tax reforms, for instance, where they change the nature and the structure of a given tax system. So even when these two conditions apply, of course, the results are not expected to be the same. Now, just the only equation I have in my slide is basically what we're trying to do is to subtract from the actual budget balance, BB, a cyclical component. That's basically what we're trying to do here. And for that, we need, again, those two, to take a stance on those two aspects. How to measure the cyclical position of the economy, how to measure the link between the cycle and the budgetary components. And this is a whole lecture in itself, but of course the issue related to estimating potential GDP is vast and numerous. And basically, despite a lot of progress, there's still not a widely accepted measure or approach in the literature to disentangle cyclical and trend GDP, so potential and short-term fluctuations. And so we have basically structural models versus statistical approaches, and both have strengths and weaknesses. And in what follows, I will use the statistical approach because it's easier to apply to a larger cross-section of countries. And even within the statistical approaches, the standard practice is to apply the so-called statistical filter by Odrick and Prescott, which has been shown repeatedly to have a number of flaws by creating spurious business cycles, by having a problem of the end sample bias, and to having to decide on the lambda ad hoc smoothing parameter in the filter. And so, as an alternative, James Hamilton published in 2018 a regression-based filter, which is also the one I'm employing in this case. And this should basically be a big issue because it's going to be basically an intermediary for me to reach certain aspects to compute the cyclically adjusted balance, but in itself should bring a discussion about how to estimate potential GDP in a number of countries. Then the second issue is about budgetary elasticities. And the common assumption is you have a one-to-one reaction of revenue, so a one elasticity of revenue with respect to output, and a zero elasticity of output of expenditures with respect to output. These are basically the OECD's general assumptions from the working paper by Girard and André, which have been shown to be quite valid and for the OECD membership at the time. And this is an approach that is basically followed by many other people. But of course, imposing such strict elasticities on the two main components of the budget may or may not be appropriate depending on, again, the country or the region. So the alternative is then to estimate these specific revenue and expenditures elasticities, or if there are specific elasticities from previous studies, try to use them to compute a better measure of the CAB. When it comes to the issue of the one-offs, this is again a big Pandora's box. We have basically the fact that headline fiscal budget balances reflect large and often non-recurrent fiscal operations. And the problem is that these one-offs have undermined the accuracy and the usefulness of the concept of the structural balance as a measure of fiscal sustainability and discretionary fiscal stance by the Commission or the OECD or the IMF if they are not dealt properly. The characteristic being that they're basically big, disproportionately large increases, typically in revenue. And so they typically fade away in the year after that impact or have basically negligible impact afterwards. And so the obvious fix is that one has to account for these operations and exclude them from any measure of the cyclically adjusted balance. That's how you should accurately account for the underlying fiscal position and not incorporating these measures. Of course, this is a big issue that in practice has led the European Commission to write a lot on what are the practices to basically identify these one-offs. This is again a lecture in itself, but there's basically a huge element of judgment that cannot be sometimes applied horizontally across different countries, and being an element of judgment by itself is not quantitative based. And so unless you have an economist in a given desk staying there forever and doing that work ad infinitum, you're not going to be able to replicate that judgment forever and across countries. So that's a very tedious work, but it's needed. There is no other shortcut unless if you want to analyze several countries in a row, and you don't have the manpower or the knowledge to do country-by-country narrative-based approach of one-off operations, you can try a shortcut, which is this one. Typically, when you don't have this basically case-by-case approach, you can look at capital transfers. Big jumps in net capital transfers usually uncover big one-offs, because if you were to smooth out and decompose capital transfers, they should have basically a very linear path. So whenever you have basically a jump in this net capital transfers item, that's basically one way in which you can quantitatively identify these one-offs and then go back to the books and try to see if they match any privatization, any telecom 5G license sale, or something like that. Now, against this theoretical background, I then selected a few developing Asian countries and applied some of these techniques, and I've picked countries in different regions within developing Asia: Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And my point here is not to go quickly, is not to go in a great deal of detail on all the charts, but to highlight the differences with respect, for instance, the blue and the red lines. So how you obtain output gaps or potential GDP varies a lot depending on the filtering that you use, and has been shown quite extensively these days that the use of HP, especially towards the current moment, so the real-time estimation of where the economy is basically born to be much more flawed in the case of the HP than in the case of the Hamilton filter, for instance, in 2020 or 2021, because of the endpoint problem. Now, if you want to decide whether to take the 0-1 OECD expenditure revenue elasticity as a baseline to strip out the budget of these cyclical components, let's then just estimate these spending components in a disaggregated way as the OECD does. The main issue is that, of course, you would expect the unemployment-related benefits to be, on the spending side, the one that reacts most to the cycle. That's the automatic stabilizer that kicks in more prominently in bad times. But it's pretty much inexistent in developing Asia, as you'd expect, I guess. Being a little bit behind in the development curve, they do not have a sufficiently large state to cushion, from a social point of view, the most needed in face of these big swings in the economic activity. So you basically, unemployment-related benefits for the set of countries for which there is data is close to zero, which again brings back to, okay, maybe our assumption of imposing a zero elasticity on the spending side is not that exaggerated. Now, when it comes to the revenues, of course, this can be done disaggregated by looking at the different PIT, VAT, CIT taxes, but also at an aggregated way. And this links a little bit with Yothin and Tom's presentation on the buoyancy coefficients, because here what I did was basically to estimate somehow buoyancies, because they are not stripped out of the discretionary fiscal tax policy components. But what you see is most of them, with the exception of a few outliers, they fluctuate around 1 or slightly above 1. So they are basically buoyant revenues, and perhaps also here the imposition of a 1 elasticity on the revenue side may not be too exaggerated, and we can use that too. And with that, then we can do a number of exercises on, according to these assumptions, to estimate our cyclically adjusted budget balances. And this is basically the outcome of that exercise. On the left, you have basically the primary balance in blue, and then you have the cyclically adjusted balance, or the cyclically adjusted primary balance stripped out of the interest payments, which is basically not at the control of the government, estimated using the HPU, the Hamilton filter. Of course, there are differences, but the differences are not as big as when you decompose GDP, because this is, of course, then a second and third order error that you are imposing in your time series. What is interesting is once you have a measure of the CAPB, as I mentioned earlier, on the right-hand side, you can do the first difference of that series and somehow have an idea of whether the fiscal policy has been contractionary or expansionary in a given year or period. And variations of these can be done with estimated country-specific elasticities that are static or time-varying. And that, I think, is the point, again, back to the issue of the data and tax reforms. Sometimes imposing a static, country-specific, time-invariant elasticity to obtain a measure of the CAB may be too strict, unless that elasticity, and for some reason the left-hand side charts are not as beautiful in the screen as in my computer, unless for some reason the time-varying revenue elasticity is basically not statistically different from zero, which is basically the bands blue being always above and below the horizontal zero line. If that's the case, then maybe it doesn't really matter the elasticity assumption that you make, but sometimes reforms do change this pattern, and so one has to be mindful of that. And if you don't have basically the narrative information to do the identification of the one-offs, you can try to have the shortcut of looking at net capital transfers to then see if the big jumps correspond to those events that I mentioned. Now, the conclusion is, of course, this being a work in progress, typically you try to take out the one-off measures prior to do any cyclical adjustment of the budget balance, and this can be more or less aggregated depending on whether you want to do cross-country comparisons, but also depending on whether you have data to do those more disaggregated approaches. The main lesson being that there is, of course, no single way to adjusting fiscal balances, and for some countries, especially countries that are subject much more than just cyclical fluctuations or one-offs, there are other aspects that are basically going to be the focus of the work that will follow, that are related to commodity cycles and credit cycles that can be more important, especially in oil exporting or commodity exporting country, or even small island states where the productive structure of the economy may not be too diverse, and so the sources for revenue can also be more limited. And with that, I finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joao. So again, the context for that is that for our developing economies and as well as elsewhere, the challenge now is to figure out where public finances are going, to what extent they're sustainable, whether policies are consolidated, whether the budgets are consolidating enough, etc. And this is one of those tools for that, and then that informs also the extent to which we need domestic resource mobilization. So with that, let me open up the floor for any questions, either from the room. Yes, so I see 2 hands up.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to all the panelists. That was really interesting. My name's Yanni Tiskerud. I'm from the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London. I was interested in the discussion from a number of panelists about you talked about the decreasing prevalence of self-employment, but the fact that the PIT and the PAYE systems still aren't really playing a role in terms of revenues, but also redistribution. I just had a few questions related to that. Sorry, it might be easier if I just... Okay. It's obviously difficult to generalize across such different countries, but do you see any kind of common political economy factors which mean that the progressivity, the design of the system isn't as progressive as potentially it could be? Have there been any recent successes in improving the productivity of the PIT system? Have you got any examples of kind of country case studies where that has happened? And has the situation changed post-COVID-19 with the kind of in terms of maybe a reassessment of the role of the state and whether there's been any kind of discussion about that.
Yes, thanks. Christian Florent from the University of Namur in Belgium, and former to that head of the tax policy division at the Ministry of Finance. I have two questions. The first one is on tax buoyancy. To express it in very simple terms, to what extent is tax buoyancy and its trend over time driven by tax? My point is that the composition of GDP may also matter. Now, having in mind what has been illustrated in the second presentation, that most of the tax revenue comes from tax on goods and service. If the share of consumption in GDP is increasing, for example, when the country is when the trade balance is turning to be negative or deteriorating over time, this will be captured as tax buoyancy in your computation. And the same holds on the revenue side of GDP, on the relative proportion of the gross operating surplus and of the labor share. So as far as I know, you do not control for the composition of GDP. So I think we should be very careful in interpreting the tax buoyancy. Change that not directly come from the tax policy side. I think that there is a need for disentangling economic factors on the one hand and tax factors on the other hand. On structural balance, European countries have been experiencing fiscal rules that relied strongly on the structural balance during roughly a decade, starting from the sovereign debt crisis in 2010 and 11 up to the COVID crisis. The experience, I think, is that there is a huge difficulty in estimating the output gap in real terms. And that was things very complicated, and also the estimation of one-off measure, I think, is not fully captured, because between one-off and tax policy decisions that are clearly not one-off, there are also time lag issues that are not well captured, because they are not strictly one-off, but they have part of the effect of one-off. So I think that looking at the experience, even with a disaggregated approach, that's what we were relying on in EU countries, it has been very, very difficult to estimate the output gap in real term. Of course, and when you have fiscal rules that rely on that, it makes things very complicated, and at the end of the day, it may undermine the credibility of the concept of structural balance itself. So I would like to hear your view on that, and if you have something to say on the experience of the EU countries, I would be interested in it. Thanks.
Thank you. Eugénie Ribaud, I work as a project manager in Expertise France. Thank you for the presentation. Just a little question on the self-employment decrease. Is it something you observe in terms of total employment, or, I mean, does this mean that people became employees, or they just disappear in the informal sector? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have a mic, but so Yothin, there's a mic over there. Feel free to take.
Thank you for the very good questions. Maybe I can respond grouping together the questions about self-employment, informality, and PIT, I mean the personal income tax rate. So for developing economies in Asia, right, if you are asking what would be the successful case of reform in the personal income taxes, I cannot think of any at the moment. But what I can share with you is that the informality is large in Asia, as you may well aware. And the size of informality and the prevalence of it bring this issue to the fore during the COVID-19 crisis. Because unlike in the European countries or in the US, where you can reach the poor household quite quickly during the pandemic by through the bank transfer or even sending them checks because most of them are in the formal sector. In Asia, most of the pools are in the informal sector. In fact, if we think about, so today and yesterday we talked about the poor household, the bottom 20%, right? For Asia, looking at that bottom 20%, less than half of them are under the social safety net or social protection. So when the pandemic hit, it was so difficult to reach them. So that's partly the problem of the informality. And I think this, in a way, is related to what you just raised about the self-employment. Whether what we see is because the decline, right? Whether what we see is they become the employees in the corporations, or they gone into the informality. Now, that is a difficult question to answer. And in particular, during the COVID-19 crisis, we know that a lot of working force, in particular women, have gone into the informal sector, right? So I think it's a good question, and probably is a good also research question to look into what happened. And I suspect that this would vary from country to country. The other thing that I can share with you is that when it comes to the personal income taxes and the state of development in Asia, we can also look at the level of e-filings of tax returns. In OECD, the e-filing of tax return is around 90%, right? But in the developing economies in Asia, that is about 60%. So it's lower. 60 versus 90, that's a lot, right? It's a 30% gap. So I think that also kind of describe to you the state of development when it comes to the personal income tax. Let me briefly touch on the questions about the taxparency. Thank you for the questions. So I understand that this taxparency is a rather macroeconomic policy tool, right? And I agree with you that we need to look into components of tax revenue to say more about what's really happening in Asia. So I showed to you that for Asia, the taxparency coefficient or the elasticity of how tax revenue respond to GDP is about 1, or for many, greater than 1, which sounds like a good thing, right? But we haven't looked into the components of tax revenue, as you pointed out, VAT, also the corporate income taxes. In fact, if you may recall, the very first and seminal paper on taxparency, going back to the Norman Gemmell and John Creedy, they look in the case of United Kingdom. What is the association between the corporate income tax and the corporate profits, which is the tax base for the corporate income tax? So I think for our analysis, we probably have to look into the subcomponents, as you pointed out. But that is a really good point. Yeah, maybe I'll pass it to other panelists.
Okay, I don't know if Celine has anything to add on the answers. No? Then Joao, why don't you take the question on the structural balance, and then Tom and I will conclude.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that whether it's a real-time or not a real-time exercise, it's still an ongoing debate on computing potential GDP or getting a measure of the structural balance, more so, of course, in real time. And that's why then on your point of the fiscal rules that have structural budget balance as an indicator, that's an unobservable variable, which casts a huge amount of doubts as to the applicability, even from the European Commission point of view. And I've done this for other exercises, and there is a huge debate on which type of fiscal rule to apply But one that is basically made on an unobservable variable, I think makes it easier to track and verify compliance than something that takes in a flow variable like expenditure rule and a stock variable like the debt to address sustainability, a combination of both. That would be, in my view, a preferable fiscal rule. But I agree that this is an ongoing debate on how to estimate potential, and even the IMF does not have a single way of doing it. Each desk does it in its own way, using combination of statistical filters, production function approach, or any other structural model. Let me just add to the other points. I think it's very relevant issue of informality, especially because I've published 3 papers on tax buoyancy myself, and informality has been shown to be negatively correlated with buoyancy. So the larger the share of informality, the smaller the buoyancy coefficient, and that I have a paper showing it. And this is also true for other projects that I'm doing on fiscal multipliers, to affect the strength of a fiscal multiplier in the sense of the traditional sense of a spending boost, right? So in countries, for instance, in Latin America where informality is higher, the fiscal multiplier is 0, okay? In comparison to countries where the informality is low, where you have the traditional positive effect of a fiscal expansion or a spending expansion. So informality is indeed an issue that needs to be taken into account to effectively do fiscal policy. And finally, I think the issue that, going back to your question on the one-offs, and the European Commission has a threshold on 0.1% of GDP above which it classified as a one-off. That's an ad hoc criteria. Whether it's valid or not for the OECD, it's one thing. For any other countries, that's another thing in terms of magnitude. But they had to put a number in addition to the judgment calls that they do. And then there's also, as we move forward, and this being a relatively recent phenomenon, but being more and more pervasive in fiscal accounts, the distinction between one-off and creative accounting or fiscal gimmickry, it's a very fine line. Okay, sometimes you don't know how to classify it because you don't know whether it's creative accounting, even if it's legal, or fiscal gimmickry, or it's really a one-off. Okay, and there's a very fine line in between classifying one or the other, and again, boils down to the issue of being a personal judgment call, having to take in a sense. So it's not a perfect science. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom?
Yeah, let me just briefly add to what Yothin said about, in response to the question on informality. First of all, the reason that it's hard to pinpoint a very clear, dramatic success story in terms of personal income tax revenue expansion or increase is that personal income tax revenues, even under the best circumstances, we don't see a dramatic increase, okay? So the 4 Asian success stories that we showed in the last slide of our presentation, all of them to different degrees had personal income tax reform as part of the package. And of course, they do contribute to more revenues, but it's a gradual evolutionary process, so please keep that in mind. Secondly, your question about why doesn't, the broader question was this, right? Why doesn't the decline in self-employment automatically translate to tangible increases in personal income tax revenue? Again, it's because of the same reason, that it's only very small and gradual change, but of course over time it's going to yield fruit. And the fundamental stylized fact here is that in many Asian countries, the fact is very few individuals are subject to the personal income tax. For example, I did a research seminar at UNESCAP in Bangkok like 7-8 years ago, because I led a ADO theme chapter on inclusive fiscal policy. And the UNESCAP the director or director general, the leader at that time, was a Pakistani national. And one thing he said during our discussions after my presentation was, in Pakistan, it was an astounding number. I forgot the exact number, but like 500,000, 600,000, very small number of Pakistani individuals paid personal income tax. That country has about 200 million people. Keep that in mind. So again, this decline in self-employment will gradually lead to higher personal income tax revenue collection, but it's not going to be a very quick, sudden, dramatic jump. Please keep that in mind.
All right, I will add my 2 cents as well on this. So if you think about both what's happened and what Asian economies are planning to do on the PIT front, I mean, in terms of raising its role or its progressivity, it's not a high priority. It's really not the focus right now. A lot more focus. So I would say in many cases, if the plan is to address progressivity, many times the focus is on the spending side instead. Also, again, much of the focus of reforms is on other elements of the tax system, whether it's property taxes, which in many countries they understand they're really under-collecting, environmental taxes, which has been discussed a lot these past 2 days, health-related taxes, and a lot is on closing holes, whether it's tax expenditures or subsidies, for example. And so I think that's where the focus is. As far as I can tell, there's really very little discussion on PIT. Even when they do it, it's sort of rationalizing, but without really, it's not going to result. They're not really looking into that being, radical changes in terms of, let's say, how much that contributes overall. So with that, I realize we're out of time. Thank you very much for everybody here and to those who participated online. And thank you for all the panelists again. And thank you.